Morning. Today I'm going to read from chapter 2 of this book, The Creation of Consciousness, Jung's Myth for the Modern Man by Edward F. Edinger. And I'm not going to stop for chats today because of limited time, but I'm going to do my best to get through it. There's a quote at the beginning of this chapter. Being and knowing are identical because if a thing does not exist, no one knows it, but whatever has most being is most known. Meister Eckhart. The goal of psychotherapy, indeed of all modes of psychological development, is the maximum degree of consciousness. Consciousness and all it signifies is the ultimate value. But what does it signify? Do we really know what we mean when we use the word? A dictionary of philosophy gives the following definition. Consciousness. A designation applied to conscious mind as opposed to a supposedly unconscious or subconscious mind, and to the whole domain of the physical and non-material. Consciousness is generally considered an indefinable term, or rather a term definable only by direct introspective appeal to conscious experiences. The indefinability of consciousness is expressed by Sir William Hamilton. Quote, "Consciousness cannot be defined. We may be ourselves fully aware what consciousness is, but we cannot, without confusion, convey to others a definition of what we ourselves clearly apprehend. The reason is plain. Consciousness lies at the root of all knowledge." This description tells us no more than consciousness cannot be defined. In Psychological Types, Jung says, quote, "By consciousness I understand the relation of psychic contents to the ego, insofar as this relation is perceived as such by the ego. Relations to the ego that are not perceived as such are unconscious. Consciousness is the function or activity which maintains the relation of psychic contents to the ego. Consciousness is not identical with the psyche because the psyche represents the totality of all psychic contents, and these are not necessarily all directly connected with the ego, i.e., related to it in such a way that they take on the quality of consciousness." Unquote. This statement offers at least a beginning for a phenomenological description of the experience of consciousness. It also states explicitly the important fact that the ego is the carrier of consciousness. We can proceed further by examining the unconscious side of the term consciousness, namely its etymology. Conscious derives from con or come, meaning with or together, and sire, to know or to see. It has the same derivative as conscience. Thus, the root meaning of both consciousness and conscious is knowing with or seeing with an other. In contrast, the word science, which also derives from sire, means simple knowing, i.e., knowing without withness. So etymology indicates that the phenomenon of consciousness and conscience are somehow related, and that the experience of consciousness is made up of two factors, knowing and withness. In other words, consciousness is the experience of knowing together with an other, and that is in a setting of two-ness. I shall now examine the implications of this statement. Knowing. One side of the phenomena of consciousness is the act of knowing. ultimately as mysterious of mental function as the closely related term consciousness. A whole branch of philosophy, epistemology, is devoted just to the problem and limits of knowledge. My approach, however, is not philosophical, but psychological, empirical, and by this method, the experience of knowing can be at least descriptively elaborated. The psychological function of knowing or seeing requires, first of all, that undifferentiated, diffuse experience be split into a subject and an object, the knowing and the knower and the known. This primordial division of original oneness corresponds to Erich Neumann's description of the separation of the world parents, the separateness of Father Sky from Mother Earth, or light from darkness, is the original cosmogonic event marking the birth of consciousness as the ability to know. As Neumann says, this act of cognition, of conscious discrimination, sunders the world into opposites, for experience of the world is only possible through opposites. The ego separates from the pleroma. The subject of knowledge is separated from the object of knowledge, and the act of knowing thus becomes possible. The original cosmogonic process of separating subject from object must be repeated with each new increment of consciousness. Each time the ego falls into an unconscious content, it can become conscious of it only by an act of separation that allows the ego to see the emerging psychic content and thus become disidentified from it. The symbol of this process of separating subject from object, the knower from the known, is the mirror. The mirror represents the psyche's ability to perceive objectively, to be removed from the deadly grip of raw primordial terror. To be removed from the deadly grip of raw primordial being. Schopenhauer describes it in these words, quote, "It is indeed wonderful to see how man, besides his life in the concrete, always lives a second life in the abstract. In the former, he is abandoned to all the storms of reality and to the influence of the present. He must struggle, suffer, and die like the animal. But his life in the abstract, as it stands before his rational consciousness, is the calm reflection of his life in the concrete, and of the world in which he lives. Here in the sphere of calm deliberation, what previously possessed him completely and moved him intensely appears to him cold, colorless, and for the moment foreign and strange. He is a mere spectator and observer. In respect of this withdrawal into reflection, he is like an actor who has played his part in one scene and takes his place in the audience until he must appear again. In the audience, he quietly looks on at whatever may happen, even though it be the preparation for his own death in the play. But then he again goes on stage and acts and suffers as he must." Unquote. The ability to turn an unconscious complex which has one by the throat, the ability to turn an unconscious complex which has one by the throat into an object of knowledge is an extremely important aspect of increasing consciousness. To extend Schopenhauer's analogy, it is as though one was fighting for his life in the arena, were magically transported to the position of spectator. Desperate reality becomes an image of contemplation, and the subject as knower is removed beyond harm. This idea appears in the apocryphal Acts of John. At the time of the crucifixion, John could not bear to witness Jesus' suffering and fled to the Mount of Olives. There, Jesus appeared to him in a vision and explained the meaning of the crucifixion, i.e., enabled John to contemplate it as an objective image. Although the multitude thought Jesus the man was being crucified, John was instructed to see it symbolically. Quote, "Now what those things are I signify unto thee, for I know that you will understand. Perceive thou therefore in me the praising of the word, logos, and piercing of the word, the blood of the word, the wound of the word, the hanging up of the word, the suffering of the word, the nailing, fixing of the word, the death of the word, and so speak I, separating off the manhood, i.e., removing personal elements. When he had spoken unto me these things, and others which I know not how to say as he would have me, he was taken up. No one of the multitudes having beheld him, and when I went down, I laughed them all to scorn, holding fast this one thing in myself, that the Lord contrived all things symbolically by a dispensation toward man for their conversion and salvation." Unquote. Now this is footnote, the Apocryphal New Testament, published by Oxford University Press in 1960, page 256. Earlier in chapter 95 of the Acts of John, Jesus had told his disciples, quote, "A mirror am I to thee that perceivest me," unquote. And in chapter 96 he says, quote, "Behold thyself in me, perceive what I do, for thine is this passion of the manhood, which I am about to suffer," unquote. In this text, Jesus is instructing the disciples how to separate subject from object, how to perceive experience as a mirror that provides an image of meaning, rather than as chaotic anguish. This corresponds to active imagination or meditative reflection, which can turn an oppressive mood into an object of knowledge by discovering the meaningful image embedded in the mood. Jung, describing his own decisive encounter with the unconscious, says, quote, "To the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured," unquote. The classical mythical example of the value of separating subject from object by the power of reflection is found in the myth of Perseus and Medusa. To look upon Medusa directly is to turn into stone, i.e., she represents a psychic content that destroys the ego. She can be overcome only by viewing her through reflection in the mirror shield which Athena provides for Perseus. I consider Athena's mirror shield ultimately to symbolize the process of human culture itself, which redeems man from the destructive Medusan horror of raw being. Language, art, drama, and learning provide the Athena mirror for humanity, allowing the psyche to emerge and develop. What Shakespeare says about drama is true for all culture forms. They hold the mirror up to nature. Schiller describes the function of art in the same way. Quote, The serious purpose of genuine art is not merely to translate the human being into a momentary dream of freedom, but actually to make him free. It accomplishes this by awakening a power within him, by using and developing this power to remove to a distance of objectivity the sensory world, which otherwise only weighs us down as raw material and oppresses us as a blind force. And Nietzsche expresses a similar idea when he says that, quote, "The truly serious task of art is to save the eye from gazing into the horrors of the night, and to deliver the subject by the healing balm of illusion from the spasms of the agitations of the will." Unquote. Dreams and fantasy can serve the same mirror function. For example, a man in the early stages of analysis dreamed that he looked into a mirror and was amazed to see that his face was his father's face. This man was identified with his father and was living out his father's unhappy fate. The dream was a mirror enabling him to see that fact, to make his identification with his father an object of knowledge. Thus, the subject of knowledge, the ego, became separated from the object of knowledge, identification with the father, and the dreamer took his first step out of that identification and into greater consciousness. Unquote. Being known. To be able to climb out of the misery of raw being into the status of a knowing subject is a part of the meaning of consciousness, and at times can be a salvation. The experience of being the knowing subject, however, is only one half of the process of knowledge. The other half is the experience of being the known object. The ego as knower conquers the outer or inner other by relegating to it the status of known object. But this is not consciousness in the full sense of knowing with. It is only science or simple knowing. To achieve authentic consciousness, the ego must also go through the experience of being the object of knowledge, with the function of the knowing subject residing in the other. To some extent, the experience of being the known object takes place in the course of psychotherapy. The therapist often carries the projection of the knowing other, causing the patient to feel reduced to the status of a known object. However, this transference-induced condition is partial and temporary. It is also dangerous since the patient is liable to get caught in a personal dependence on the human being who knows him. Dependence on the therapist becomes a substitute for dependence on the inner knowing one, i.e., the self. In a letter written in 1915, Jung describes vividly the dangers to the patient of being known or understood by the analyst. Quote, "Understanding is a fearfully binding power, at times a veritable murder of the soul as soon as it flattens out vitally important differences. The core of the individual is a mystery of life which is snuffed out when it is grasped. The menacing and dangerous thing about analysis is that the individual is apparently understood. The devil eats his soul away, which naked and exposed, robbed of its protecting shell, was born like a child into the light. That is the dragon, the murderer, that always threatens the newborn divine child. He must be hidden once more from the understanding of humanity." As Jung indicates in other sections of the same letter, the therapist's understanding of the patient is a necessary cautery for neurotic aspects of the personality. However, it should not be applied to the healthy psyche. Thus, the full experience of being the known object of an other knowing subject is best not projected onto a person, but rather experienced as an encounter with the inner God image, the self. The archetypal image that carries the clearest symbolic expression of the ego's experience of being the known object is the image of the eye of God. This image played a large role in Egyptian mythology. According to Rundle Clark, quote, "The eye of the high god is the great goddess of the universe in her terrible aspect. Originally, it had been sent out into the primeval waters by God on an errand to bring back Shu and Tefnut to their father, thus the eye of the daughter of the high god. When it returned, it found that it had been supplanted in the Great One's face by another, a surrogate eye, which we can interpret as the sun or moon. This was the primary cause for the wrath of the eye and the great turning point in the development of the universe, for the eye can never be fully or permanently appeased. The high god turned it into a rearing cobra, which he bound around his forehead to ward off his enemies," unquote. In the dreams of a middle-aged woman, I have found an interesting parallel to the mythological equation of I equals snake. This patient was suffering from a chronic, painful physical illness and also was suffering psychologically in the effort to understand the meaning of her ordeal. She had this dream reported in part, quote, "I am talking with friends. Something we talked about caused snakes to start crawling about the room. It was as though they had been inanimate objects on the wall that had been brought to life by something I said. I wanted to kill them, but a friend said I shouldn't," unquote. The next dream, a few days later, was this, quote, "I went to the kitchen sink to clean it up. It was actually just wet. As I looked at it, the drops of water separated. Each drop had a center in it, like a fish egg or eyes. I did not throw them away," unquote. This woman tended to take the attitude of passive victim. These dreams occurred when she was starting to experience rebellious reactions against the victim role. The dreams indicate that paying attention to the unconscious, talking about it, brought the snakes to life. Later, the snakes turned into fishes' eyes or eggs. The movement is the reverse of the Egyptian myth, in which the eye of God is turned into a rearing serpent. The idea would seem to be that the emerging instinctual reactions of protest, the snakes, are actually autonomous centers of consciousness, fish's eyes, and hence are subjects to the ego's object. In other words, the dreamer was beginning to experience herself as the object of another subject. That other subject, the self, will not tolerate the meek passivity of the victim role, and by noting the reactions of inner protest, the woman discovered the objective subject within, i.e., the self. The image of fish's eyes comes up in alchemy as the oculi piscium and corresponds to the scintillae or multiple luminosities in the unconscious. Jung writes, quote, "The fish's eyes are tiny soul sparks from which the shining figure of the filius divine child is put together. They correspond to the particles of light imprisoned in the dark faces, whose reconstruction is one of the chief aims of Gnosticism and Manichaeism, unquote. The same image is discussed in his essay on the nature of the psyche, where again the multiple-eyed motif is equated with multiple luminosities. To be watched by strange fishy eyes gives one the uncanny sense of other presences. The fish's eyes correspond to the multiple eye of God as described in Zechariah. Quote, "These 7 are the eyes of the Lord which range through the whole earth," unquote. Zechariah 4:10, Revised Standard Version. The major effect of such an experience is the realization that one is not alone in the psyche. In another Egyptian text, the eye of God says of itself, "I am the all-seeing eye of Horus, whose appearance strikes terror, Lady of Slaughter, Mighty One of Frightfulness." The experience of being a known object, being seen by the eye of God, can be a fearsome experience because unconscious contents, as a rule, cannot stand to be observed. They react violently to being known because this destroys and relativizes the autonomy, the omnipotence they enjoy while operating unconsciously. These unconscious contents or complexes are various aspects of ego self-identity, which is profoundly threatened by being subordinated to the status of an object known to be a transcendental subject. Welcome. Hi, Penelope. Nice to see you. I'm racing along here because I have 32 minutes to complete this chapter. Jung's first childhood dream contains the image of the eye and illustrates another aspect of its phenomenology. Between the ages of 3 and 4, he dreamed, quote, "I discovered a dark rectangular stone-lined hole in the ground. I had never seen it before. I ran forward curiously and peered down into it. Then I saw a stone stairway leading down. Hesitantly and fearfully, I descended. At the bottom was a doorway with a round arch, closed off by a green curtain. It was a big, heavy curtain of worked stuff like brocade, and it looked very sumptuous. Curious to see what might be hidden behind, I pushed it aside. I saw before me in the dim light a rectangular chamber about 30 feet long. The ceiling was arched and of hewn stone. The floor was laid with flagstones, and in the center a red carpet ran from the entrance to a low platform. On this platform stood a wonderfully rich golden throne. I am not certain, but perhaps a red cushion lay on the seat. It was a magnificent throne, a real king's throne in a fairy tale. Something was standing on it, which I thought at first was a tree trunk 12 or 15 feet high and about 1.5 to 2 feet thick. It was a huge thing, reaching almost to the ceiling, but it was of a curious composition. It was made of skin and naked flesh, and on top there was something like a rounded head with no face and no hair. On the very top of the head was a single eye, gazing motionlessly upward. It was fairly light in the room, although there were no windows and no apparent source of light. Above the head, however, was an aura of brightness. The thing did not move, yet I had the feeling that it might at any moment crawl off the throne like a worm and creep toward me. I was paralyzed with terror. At that moment, I heard from outside and above me my mother's voice. She called out, quote, "Yes, look at him. That is the man-eater," unquote. That intensified my terror still more, and I awoke sweating and scared to death, unquote. The phallic eye in this dream certainly fits the description of the Eye of Horus, whose appearance strikes terror. The fact that it is called the man-eater corresponds to Jung's remark that understanding eats the soul away. The eye as phallus is analogous to the eye as snake and would allude to the creative power of seeing and being seen. Similarly, in the Old Testament, to know is synonymous with to have intercourse with. The terror caused by the eye is due to its connection with the wrath of God. An ancient Egyptian myth of the destruction of mankind illustrates how the eye of God can function as the instrument of divine wrath. The terror caused by the eye... Oh, wait a minute. Right. Quote, "Re, the god who created himself, was originally king over gods and men together, but mankind schemed against his sovereignty, for he began to grow old. When he realized that mankind was plotting against him, he said to his suite, 'Go summon me hither my eye, together with Shu, Tefnut, Geb, and Nut, and all the fathers and mothers who were with me in the primeval waters.' So the gods were brought together, and they said, quote, 'Speak to us that we may hear,' unquote. So Re addressed none, personification of the primeval waters. Quote, 'O eldest God, in whom I myself came into being, and you, O ancient gods, behold mankind who came from my eye, have been scheming against me. Tell me what you would do about it.' Then none said, 'O Re, my son, O God, O Re, my son, O God, greater than he who made him, and mightier than they who created him. O you that now sit upon your throne, if your eye were turned against those who are plotting against you, how greatly would they fear you?' Then the others who were about him said, 'Let your eye be sent out to seize those who are plotting evil against you. Let it descend upon them as Hathor.' So the goddess came and slew mankind in the desert." Unquote. In this text, the eye of God is the agency of the Last Judgment. This theme is also a symbolic expression of the ego's experience of being an object of knowledge. In many religions, the judgment of the soul is projected into the afterlife and conceived as a post-mortem experience in which the individual is finally subject to total scrutiny and is made the object of the comprehensive knowledge of God. Depending on the outcome of this trial, he will either be acquitted and sent to paradise or condemned and sentenced to hell. I just mentioned that this sounds very much like karma in Hinduism and Buddhism to me. The image of the Last Judgment can be understood psychologically as a projection into the afterlife of the ego's encounter with the self and the archetypal experience of being the known object of a transpersonal subject. It is an awesome experience, as the myths make clear, an experience that man has understandably tried to postpone as long as possible by transferring it into the afterlife. The theme of being looked at or made the object of knowledge comes up often in dreams. For instance, a man dreamed that news cameras were set up to photograph him, but he was trying to avoid the cameras. Like a primitive, the dreamer was afraid of the eye of the camera. Sometimes during a major life crisis, the explicit image of the eye of God will appear in dreams. For instance, a young man who was going through a crucial transition leading to entanglement of let me read that again. For instance, a young man who is going through a critical transition leading to enlargement of consciousness has this apocalyptic dream. Quote, I was in a room or house that was made of adobe bricks, very earthen. The floor had a fine powder on it, like a residue from dry clay. The room was gray. Very little light seemed to be in the room, yet it was illuminated. I heard the pounding of the surf outside the room. This pounding became more and more intense on the walls as it grew louder and louder. The walls began to shake and rupture. Silt was in the air from the shaking walls and covering me. Cracks and splits in the walls appeared. The room felt as if it were going to collapse on top of me. I felt I would be crushed by the bricks and the flood of water. The walls were buckling, and the clay bricks loosened up and crumbling in. More and more they fell around me. My life seemed to flash through my mind. I had to get out. I could not perish here. Now I was scared. I didn't know what was on the other side, except I could hear the water crashing in on the walls. With all my strength, I reached far up over my head and ran toward the cracking wall. I hit and pushed the wall. Again and again I stepped back and hit the wall. Behind me, everything was crumbling in. I was screaming. Rocks and water were all about me. Again I crashed the wall and pushed as hard as I could. The wall buckled and ripped. It split, cracked, and groaned. Whole sheets of bricks that were coming in on me groaned. Whole sheets of bricks that were coming in on me pushed outward by the force of my throwing my whole weight into the wall. The noise was thundering. Panic had gripped me. With another thrust, I felt as if all my strength would be drained, but yet again I hit the wall in what seemed like an even stronger thrust than before. The wall fell out before me. Everything behind me had silenced or was gone. I didn't know. Instinctively, I looked up and saw a round eye that had blue sky and some white clouds in it. My perspective was one of a reverse telescopic field. It seemed as if, as I looked up at it, it looked down at me, as if I could see the eye that was looking up at it. As if I could see the eye that was looking up at it, and yet it felt to be something wholly other. I was in awe and felt deeply humbled and inexplicably human. Okay, now this is where this eye that's in the placard comes up, and let me see if I can just show that to you in a slightly different form, because this is where it appears in the book. Okay, I'm just going to show you that briefly. But anyway, that's the image that Dr. Edinger was referring to. Another example is the dream of a middle-aged man who is going through an important psychological transition. He had developed physical symptoms which were ominously similar to those of an illness which had killed his father when he was only a few years older than the patient's present age. These symptoms threw the man into a state of acute anxiety, which was relieved in part only after thorough medical examinations proved that the symptoms had no organic basis. During his state of anxiety, he had this dream, reported in part. Quote, President Nixon was addressing a large group of people in a hall. I was sitting on a bench right next to his lectern. The thought crossed my mind, if I tried to kill him, no one could stop me. 2 guards in uniform came past me. One turned off all the house lights. A strange orange light came up at the back wall, where a large metal screen lifted, revealing some kind of scanning device. A loud hum became audible as the scanning device screened the hall with a mysterious ray. I saw a large eye through an opening in the back wall, looking at in my direction and then roving over the hall. A shot rang out. A teenage boy who had evidently planned to kill the president had shot himself. When the lights were turned on again, President Nixon was kneeling in prayer. Unquote. The chief image of this dream is the numinous eye of God. It is evident that the patient's fear of death has constellated the theme of divine judgment. The patient has a negative father complex with unconscious hostility toward father figures indicated by the death thoughts directed toward President Nixon. The death thoughts. Let me read that sentence again since I dropped the book. The patient has a negative father complex with unconscious hostility toward father figures indicated by the death thoughts directed toward President Nixon. The appearance of the eye of God has the effect of neutralizing this complex. The adolescent commits suicide. The manifestation of the self has dissolved an unconscious complex and left in its wake a religious attitude. President Nixon bending in prayer. Another middle-aged man, also experiencing an anxiety state, had this dream, reported in part. Quote, I am on a ship whose captain is an Ahab-like figure. I see a strange feminine being sitting on the railing of the ship. She touches her forehead with a wand, and at the touch a third eye appears. The captain, on seeing this miracle, rushes at the woman. He is overpowered effortlessly and led away. Unquote. In his associations, the dreamer thought of the woman with the third eye as a kind of angel. Ahab represented ego inflation to him. The captain could tolerate no happenings on his ship outside his control. Concerning the captain being led away, he was reminded of a biblical passage referring to Christ. Quote, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. Ephesians 4:8, Authorized Version. Interestingly, Jung has alluded to the same passage in his description of the ego's encounter with the self. Quote, when a summit of life is reached, then the bud unfolds, and from the lesser the greater emerges. Then, as Nietzsche says, one becomes two, and the greater figure, which one always was, but which remained invisible, appears to the lesser personality with the force of a revelation. He who is truly and hopelessly little will always drag the revelation of the greater down to the level of his littleness, and will never understand that the day of judgment for his littleness has dawned. But the man who is inwardly great will know that the long-expected friend of his soul, the immortal one, has now really come to lead captivity captive, that is, to seize hold of him by whom this immortal had always been confined and held prisoner, and to make his life flow into the greater life, a moment of deadliest peril." Unquote. The most striking image in the dream is the angel's third eye. This would correspond to the third eye of Shiva, which in Hindu mythology is said to have dangerous, destructive qualities. Concerning the three eyes of Shiva, Alan Danielou writes, quote, "The three eyes of Shiva represent the sun, the moon, and fire, the three sources of light that illuminate the earth, the sphere of space, and the sky. The Puranas and Upanishads speak of him whose eyes are sun, moon, and fire. Through his three eyes, Shiva can see the three forms of time, past, present, and future. The three eyes are said to shine like three suns. The frontal eye, the eye of fire, is the eye of higher perception. It looks mainly inward. When directed outward, it burns all that appears before it. It is from a glance of this third eye that Kama, the lord of lust, was burned to ashes, and that the gods and all created beings are destroyed at each of the periodical destructions of the universe. Shiva's third eye is similar to the Egyptian eye of God that can be the agency of destruction. In psychological terms, the eye will be destructive of all in the ego that is not appropriately related to the self. In other words, it will destroy inflated ego self-identity as represented by Ahab. According to Jacob Boehm, quote, "Divine wisdom is the union wherein God eternally sees himself, he being that union himself. In the love of the light of God, that mirror is called the wisdom of God, but in the wrath it is called the all-seeing eye." In the archetypal image of the eye of God, has been activated, it means, I'm having a little problem with my vision on my left side, and sometimes I misread words. I apologize for that. Okay. If the archetypal image of the eye of God has been activated, it means that one is going through an ordeal analoging to that of Job. Jung states that Satan in the book of Job is presumably one of God's eyes, which go to and fro in the earth and walk up and down in it. Job 1:7. Satan has been represented as a being with many eyes. There is a tarot deck which pictures the devil as Argus with many eyes all over his body. The eye of God is thus usually experienced as that aspect of the self which is the adversary of the ego. Hence, the sense of ordeal which usually accompanies the experience. The description applies to all four individuals whose dreams I have presented. Let me just see how much more I have because, okay, I'm going to have to make this a two-part reading because I have a commitment with my mother-in-law in a few minutes, and so I will read the second half of this later this afternoon. I apologize for that, but that's the way it is. So we have to pay our tribute to life, as I say. But as I say, this eye of God that Dr. Edinger is referring to here, to me, sounds very much like karma. In other words, You can get away with doing some dastardly deeds in the physical world. But if you do that, then there's something in your unconscious that will make you pay. That will make you pay later. And that is karma. And in my experience, karma works 100% perfectly. And as Dr. Edinger said one time, the universe is in balance. So if you do something that's imbalanced, you're going to pay for it later. And so we can all watch and see what happens with people who do dastardly deeds and see how they pay later. I won't mention names here, but many of you can guess, I suppose. Anyway, I will be back later this afternoon to finish this chapter. I'm sorry it ended up being so long that I had to stop for a couple of hours, but I'll be back. So thank you for joining me this